Well, I was doing a little research on the days of our lives, not the soap opera, for those of you who watch soap operas. But most of us want to know the days of our lives. Well, research tells us that as of now, the average lifespan of both men and women is 75 years. So think about that for a moment. Some of you have surpassed that by a few years. Some of you, like Mid, have surpassed it by quite a few years, and we're going to sing happy birthday to Mid later because she just had her 90th birthday. But if you live 75 years, that's about, well, that is 27,375 days. Think about that, 27,375 days. That seems like a lot of days. And yet, how quickly they pass. And so our basic interest this day is not in counting our days, but in making sure that our days count. And the way that our days count is to make sure that our purpose in life is something we know. We've determined what our central purpose in life is. Now, if I ask you, what's your central purpose in life? Probably most of you wouldn't be able to answer that right away. Some people might be able to say a parent, a worker. Some people may have their purpose in life to be self-gratification and pleasure. I know some people like that. That's their central purpose in life. For some, it's status seeking. For others, it might be power. For some, it's keeping up with our neighbors. For others, it's raising a great family, making our parents proud. For some people, it's retiring early. I've met someone who said, I'm going to be retired by the time I'm 40. Wow. I like that idea. For others, it's doing good works in our community. But whatever your central purpose in life is, whether you consciously choose it, or whether you just drift along with your desires, and it suddenly happens without your even thinking too much about it, we measure the success or the failure of each one of our 27,375 days. Well, Jesus only lived about 12,045 of those days. We believe he died somewhere around the age of 33. And yet, historians and theologians all agree that he was the most influential person who ever lived on the face of the earth. From the age of 12, he demonstrated that he knew what his central purpose in life was. Now remember when he was 12 and he disappeared and his parents were looking everywhere for him and they found him in the temple, and his mom must have been really angry. I could put myself in her position. And she's kind of yelling at him, where were you? What are you doing? And he says, well, what are you asking me for? I was about my Father's work. Jesus knew from the time he was 12 what his central purpose in life was. And he knew that, and he followed that. Even when God's will for him was painful, even when Jesus' friends didn't support him, he still only lived to fulfill God's purpose in life. And so our Bible passage today finds us going with Jesus for a rare moment of teaching where he wants his disciples to be away from the crowds. He doesn't want anybody around because he knows that now he's getting toward the end of his life. And he has so much more to teach the disciples. Our passage tells us, and how many times in the Bible have you read, and they didn't get it. They didn't understand. They don't know what he's talking about. And so Jesus decides we better do some serious teaching here. So they passed through Galilee, and Jesus didn't want anybody to know they were there because he was going to teach his disciples. And so he tells them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands. They're going to kill him, and then after 3 days he will rise again. And the disciples are like, what? Okay, that made no sense. And so Jesus understood his purpose. He understood the mind of God. And Jesus used prayer a lot to understand that. Through prayer, he filled his mind with the thoughts of God, and he filled his life and his heart with the will of God. He filled his mouth with the words of God, and he pointed his feet on the pathways that God put before him. And so it's painfully obvious in this passage that the disciples just didn't get it. They didn't understand him. And it had to be so frustrating for him because they've been with him now almost 3 years. And you would think after almost 3 years you'd get something. Can you imagine being in a classroom for 3 years trying to learn something? Maybe the multiplication tables? Everybody go back to remembering when you had to learn the I know we don't do that anymore, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Most people in this room had to learn the multiplication tables. For some of us, it was easier than others, and for others of us, it just seemed like it was never going to happen. And Jesus must be so frustrated. How many times do I have to tell you what's going to happen here? And so he stops. He stops what he's doing, and he sits down. Now, that seems like just a phrase that got thrown out, but you have to go back to Jesus' time to understand how important that was. You see, the rabbis didn't teach standing up. They always sat down. And so Jesus gathered his 12 around him, and he sat down, and he tries to teach them. And so he's challenging them to understand, to hear, to listen. And so they're walking into this home along the road, and he's hearing them arguing. And he gets into the house, and he says, "What were you arguing about?" They're kind of busted. They're all quiet, kind of like my husband's busted right now. They're all busted because they've been arguing with each other about who's the most important, who's the greatest of all. They don't want to tell Jesus that, but they're concerned about it. They want to know who's the greatest of all. So Jesus, at that point, had to be going, "Oh my God, they're just never going to get this. I'm telling them that I'm going to die, and then in 3 days I'm going to rise again. And they're over here arguing about who's going to be the better of them." I just can't even imagine what Jesus had to be thinking. Jesus had to be one of the most patient people in the world. And so he sits down and he tells them, if you want to be great, if you want to be first, you have to be last. Now that's an odd thing to say. But he says it doesn't matter. The first must be last and the servant of all. Now think back to the stories you know of Jesus. That's what Jesus was. He was the servant of all. He washed the disciples' feet. And remember, they didn't want that to happen. You shouldn't be washing our feet. We should be washing yours. No, I am your servant. And he demonstrated that. Doesn't matter if you're the janitor of a large company or if you're the CEO. It's your central purpose as a follower of Christ to serve. And successful people know that. I'm going to give you an example of a very successful man, a real success story. Anybody know who Dave Thomas was? Wendy's, okay? Dave Thomas was the CEO of Wendy's. He died, I believe, in 2002. Well, Dave never graduated from high school, but he went on to run one of the most successful companies. He was adopted as a child and never finished high school. But in his book that's called Well Done, The Common Guy's Guide to Everyday Success, he tells the story of his success. And he says that he got his MBA a long time before he got his GED. He says he has a photograph of him standing with a mop and a bucket in an apron. And he says that is the best picture that he's ever had. He said it wasn't a gag. He said it showed his philosophy of leading by example. And at Wendy's, he says that an MBA doesn't mean Master of Business Administration. It means a mop bucket attitude. A commitment to service. Well, that's what Jesus was trying to get the disciples to understand. They didn't need an MBA to figure out who was going to be first. They needed a mop bucket attitude to figure out that their central purpose in life was to serve. I'm going to tell you one other interesting story that I found. Marion Hill, and I don't know if anybody knows who she was, but she had kind of a fairy tale life. She was born in a palace in Hungary. And we all have heard the phrase that you're born with a silver spoon in her mouth. Well, she literally, her first spoon was solid gold. So she was sent to Vienna, where she became an actress. She went to school in Vienna. She became an actress, and she fell in love with a young medical student named Otto. Well, she and Otto were married, and they moved to Hollywood, California. They set up their house, and Otto began to dabble in movies. Anybody know where this might be going? He became so interested in movies that he gave up his medical practice, and he became very famous as the director, Otto Preminger. Now, Marion's beauty and wit and irresistible charm brought her everything that she ever desired. In Europe, in Hollywood, in New York, she became the ultimate international hostess. But she couldn't handle the fast life. She turned to alcohol, she turned to drugs, and she had numerous affairs. She ended up divorcing Otto, and she tried to commit suicide 3 times. Then she met another doctor, Dr. Albert Schweitzer. And over the period of time, about 6 months, she counseled with him every day because her life was an absolute mess. And when the time came for him to return to his simple medical hospital in the jungles of Africa, she went with him. And she spent the rest of her life as a hospital servant. So she wrote her autobiography, and she chose for the title, "All I Want Is Everything." Where'd she get that title? You see, when she died, Time magazine quoted her from her autobiography, and she wrote, "Albert Schweitzer says there's 2 kinds of people. There are the helpers, and there are the non-helpers. I thank God that he allowed me to become a helper, and in helping, I found everything." So do you see what she was saying? She was saying that the happiest people are the ones that understand that life is about serving. And the unhappiest people are those who think that life is about being served. When are we going to learn this truth? When will the disciples learn it? Obviously, they're having a hard time with it. So Jesus takes a little child. Now remember that in Jesus' time, children were even more disposable than women. They were to be seen, barely, never heard, and they were not considered in anything. And Jesus goes, and he has to do something to get the disciples to understand. And so he goes and he gets a little child, and he puts the little child in his arms, and he says to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." A little child. There's a story that a group of European theologians traveled to Calcutta to meet with Mother Teresa and to try to learn from her. And she said to them, "You try to do what I do, and then you'll be able to enjoy what I'm doing." And so she took them to the orphanage, and she walked around and she found a little child playing in the mud, perfectly happy, covered in mud from head to toe. And she picked him up and she kissed him. And she expected her guests to do the same. And none of them did. None of them got it. The way that we best serve God is by serving others. I'm going to close with one story that I found on the internet about a famous knight who wanted to serve his king, and he wanted to be the most noble knight in the world. And so at his knighting, he was so overcome with dedication to his king that he vowed an oath. He said that he would always bow his knees and lift up his arms in homage to his king, and only to his king. So the knight was given the task of guarding the city on the frontier of the kingdom. And every day he stood at attention and never moved. Years passed, and one day a peasant woman was coming by with her cart full of vegetables to sell at the market, and the cart hit a rock and fell over, and all the vegetables went running. And she looked to the guard who just stood there, and she quickly gathered them up and put them back in and kept going. Time passed, and one day a man with a broken leg was passing and his crutch broke. And the man fell on the ground and he said, "Good night, sir. Would you bow down and help me up?" But the knight would not, because he did not want to break his vow to the king. He just stood there in his full armor. More years passed, and the knight's grandson came by one day and said, Grandpa, pick me up and let's go to the fair." And the knight stood there and said, "I cannot, or I'll break my vow to the king." Finally, one day, the king came to check on the knight. And the knight was standing there, and tears were running down his face. And the king said, "Sir, you are the most noble knight that I have. Why are you crying?" And the knight said, "I am unable to keep my vow. I am unable to bend or lift my arms to you anymore." You see, his armor had rusted, and he was not able to move anymore. The king replied, "Perhaps if you'd helped and knelt to help all those who passed by and lifted your arms to embrace all those who came to you, you would have been able to keep your vow to pay me homage today." That's it. That's how it works. Make your life count. Find a place where you can serve. It might be in your workplace, it might be in a school, it might be here at the church, but find a place where you can serve. And you'll find true happiness. Happiness that you never imagined could be. That is the message that Jesus was trying to get his disciples to hear. And let anyone with ears to hear listen. Amen.